the Threndaxian battlecruiser. Voice of Ash hung in orbit, its command deck bathed in the red emergency light of a ship that had just lost 400 souls in 11 minutes. Fleet Commander Osric Vane gripped the edge of his console, claws digging into metal, and stared at the tactical display where a single human dropship, one ship, not a squadron, had just carved a path through his defensive screen like it wasn't there. "Report," he snarled, his weapons officer, voice trembling, could only say. "They're not attacking the fleet, Commander. They're rescuing someone." Osric's blood ran cold. Rescuing. In the middle of a full-scale invasion, with 300 warships bearing down on a planet that had possessed spaceflight for less than 2 centuries, one human pilot had broken formation, flown directly into the teeth of the Threndaxian Armada, and was now hauling a burning escape pod containing enemy soldiers. Soldiers. Out of a debris field, because leaving them to die wasn't something the human could live with. Nothing in Threndaxian military doctrine had prepared him for an enemy that fought like that. But none of this had begun that way. 3 days earlier, humanity didn't know the Threndaxian Compact existed. The Compact was old. Older than human civilization by a margin so vast that their historians measured Earth's entire recorded history as a rounding error. They were a union of 17 conquered species, bound together under the iron doctrine of the Grand Curator caste, whose singular purpose was cataloging and absorbing every primitive civilization the galaxy had to offer. Resistance was recorded, studied, and then erased. It had happened 412 times. Earth was to be the 413th line in the ledger. Fleet Commander Osric Vane did not expect resistance. He expected surrender within 6 hours. The Compact's own statistical models guaranteed it. Humanity had no fleet to speak of, no planetary shield network, no allies. By every metric the curators tracked, Earth was defenseless. What the curators had failed to catalog was why. Humans built the things they built. 6 hours after first contact, half the invasion fleet's scanning arrays had gone dark. Not from weapons fire but from something far stranger. Every satellite, every orbital relay, every automated defense platform humanity possessed had been repurposed in the last 4 hours into something the Threndaxians had no name for. A distributed neural targeting mesh, cobbled together from consumer electronics, decommissioned rockets, and systems that, according to Compact intelligence, shouldn't have existed at all. The Compact's spies had rated Earth's military as negligible. They had not accounted for the fact that humanity's civilian infrastructure was, itself, a weapon in waiting. That wasn't even the biggest surprise. Colonel Renata Okafor stood in the command bunker beneath what used to be Geneva, watching the projection of alien ships bloom across the display like a rash spreading over the Earth's curve. She was 51 years old, had buried a husband in a war nobody remembered anymore, and had exactly one thought running through her mind. They don't know what they're dealing with. "Colonel, the fleet's broadcasting again," said Lieutenant Sarn, a young officer whose hands hadn't stopped shaking since the ships first appeared. "Same message, surrender terms. Play it." The translated voice that filled the bunker was flat, mechanical, utterly without malice, which was somehow worse than if it had screamed for blood. Species designation: human. Resistance is recorded as statistically futile in 412 prior engagements. Submit for cataloging. Violence will cease upon compliance. Renata almost laughed, not from amusement. From something closer to grief for the aliens who had sent that message, because they clearly had no idea what compliance would cost them. "Send the response," she said. "Colonel, are you sure?" Send it." The message that went out to the Threndaxian fleet was 4 words long, translated into every dialect their listening posts could parse. "We choose our children." It meant nothing to the curators. It would mean everything by the end of the week. The truth stunned the entire galaxy. Though it took time to spread. Humanity did not fight like a civilization, trying to preserve its power structures, its wealth, or its territory. It fought like a species that had spent its entire violent, blood-soaked history learning exactly one lesson over and over. That the price of losing was watching the people you loved suffer, and that lesson had been carved so deep into human culture that it showed up in everything. Their architecture built to shelter. Their medicine built to heal strangers. their soldiers trained to die covering retreats they'd never live to see the end of. The Threndaxians fought efficiently. Humans fought like they had something to lose that was worth more than their own lives, and that made them nearly impossible to properly model. Osric Vane learned this personally on the third day, when his flagship's boarding parties breached a human orbital hospital station. A soft target, by compact logic, full of the wounded and the dying, undefended. It was not undefended. Every doctor, every nurse, every conscious patient, who could still lift a fire extinguisher or a scalpel, fought back. Not because they believed they could win, because retreating meant abandoning the people in the beds behind them, and that was a thing none of them were willing to do. One nurse, barely out of training, held a jammed airlock shut with her own body weight for 4 minutes so a surgical team could finish stabilizing a child with shrapnel in her chest. And when the boarding party finally forced the door, they found the surgery still in progress, gloved hands steady despite the gunfire 2 decks away. 23 Threndaxian soldiers died, taking a station with no weapons, no shields, and no military value whatsoever, and Osric received the after-action report in silence, unable to make his translator software produce a word for what he felt. He requested the surgical footage afterward, expecting propaganda. What he got instead was a security recording, unedited, showing the surgeon never once look up at the chaos beyond the glass. Osric watched it 7 times before he understood that the footage wasn't meant for him at all. It was simply what had happened, indifferent to whether anyone was watching. His science officer, a quiet Velinar named Chask, who had spent decades studying primitive species, finally spoke the thought aloud. "Commander, I don't think we are fighting soldiers. I think we are fighting a species that has already decided dying is preferable to certain kinds of survival." Nobody knew what the human was hiding, not yet. But Chask was starting to understand. And understanding, for a curator, was the most dangerous thing of all. The council had made a terrible mistake, though they wouldn't admit it for 2 more days. Grand Curator Thessa Mel Oryx, watching the campaign unfold from the Compact's core worlds, had authorized the invasion based on a probability model that treated all primitive species as fundamentally the same. Fragile, self-interested, and rational in the narrow sense that they would choose survival over principle every single time. It was a model that had worked 412 times. It failed on humanity, because humans were not fundamentally rational in that narrow sense. They were rational in a much stranger, much more dangerous way, willing to accept staggering losses today to guarantee that some version of tomorrow existed for people they'd never meet. The Queen suddenly froze when the analysts finally decoded a piece of intercepted human communication. A recording from a field commander to her exhausted troops, days into the fighting, when Earth's makeshift defense grid was buckling, and losses were mounting into the thousands. "They think if they hurt us enough, we'll stop caring. They've never met anyone like us." Thessa Mel Oryx had catalogued 412 civilizations. She understood in that moment that she had never actually catalogued a single one of them. Only their surrender. Everything changed in the next few seconds, 3 days into the invasion, when Osric Vane's fleet cornered what should have been an easy kill, a single human dropship, damaged, alone, deep in contested space, no backup within range. Standard doctrine called for immediate destruction. Instead, Osric watched the pilot, call sign later identified as Captain Idris Reyes, fly directly toward a burning Threndaxian escape pod that his own fleet had crippled minutes earlier, and pull the enemy survivors aboard under fire, at the cost of his own ship's shields, at the cost of nearly his own life. Osric didn't order it stopped. He couldn't explain, even to himself, why he hesitated. Something about watching an enemy risk everything to save his people had reached past 412 prior conquests, and touched something the Compact's doctrine had never trained him to protect against. Respect. Reyes brought the survivors aboard, patched their wounds with his own ship's medkits, and broadcast one message on an open channel before limping back to Earth's defense line. "You're safe now. We don't leave people to die. Not even you." That broadcast reached every Threndaxian ship in the system. It reached Osric Vane's command deck, exactly as his weapons officer was calling for orbital bombardment authorization on the human capital. Osric didn't give it. The Council had made a terrible mistake, not in underestimating human weapons, but in underestimating human mercy, which turned out to be a far more destabilizing force than any fleet Earth could have built. Within a week, 3 separate Threndaxian commanders had quietly begun refusing direct orders to strike civilian infrastructure. Chask, the science officer, filed a formal request to open diplomatic channels instead of cataloging procedures, a request no curator in 4 centuries had ever made. Grand Curator Thessa Mel Oryx arrived in the system personally to end the crisis of confidence spreading through her own fleet. She brought with her a full disciplinary tribunal, prepared to relieve Osric Vane of command and erase the doubt spreading through his crew like a virus. She had done it before, on other worlds, to other commanders who had grown too curious about the species they were meant to erase. She did not expect to find Osric waiting for her on the command deck of his own flagship, calm, unafraid, with a request already filed for her review. Full contact status for Earth, negotiated not by force but by treaty. Beside his name on the display was a second signature, Captain Idris Reyes. Transmitted from the human capital, 2 soldiers from opposite ends of the galaxy, who had somehow, impossibly, stopped seeing each other as targets. You were supposed to catalog them, Thessa said coldly, not join them. Osric's answer became the single most quoted line in Threndaxian military history for the next 100 years. I was sent to conquer a species that surrenders. I found a species that would rather die saving a stranger than live having abandoned one. There was nothing left to conquer, Grand Curator. Only something worth understanding. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a treaty neither side had prepared documents for, negotiated in real time between a human colonel, who had buried a husband, and refused to bury anyone else's children, and a fleet commander who had crossed 412 conquered worlds, and finally found one that conquered him instead. Humanity did not join the compact. The compact, quietly and without ever officially admitting it, began to change because of humanity. Cataloging procedures rewritten, doctrine softened, 413 becoming the first line in the ledger that read, not surrendered but respected. Captain Idris Reyes never considered himself a hero. He said so, once, in an interview broadcast across 100 worlds that had never heard the word human before that week. We didn't win because we were stronger, he said. We won because we never stopped believing the person next to us was worth dying for. Turns out that's the one thing nobody in this galaxy had a weapon for. Somewhere in the cold dark beyond Earth's orbit, 412 conquered species heard those words translated into their own languages for the first time. And for the first time in their long, quiet subjugation, they allowed themselves to hope. On a world at the edge of the Compact's oldest territory, a young Velinar student, barely more than a child by her people's reckoning, asked her teacher why the humans had won a war they never should have survived. The teacher, who had spent her whole life memorizing the 412 names of the conquered, found she had no easy answer. She only knew that somewhere among the stars, an entire species had looked at overwhelming odds and decided that surrender was not the price of survival, that some things were worth more than staying alive to see tomorrow. She told her student to remember the name of the planet instead, Earth. Not as a line in the ledger of the fallen, but as the first world the Compact had ever met and failed to break. In the archives that mattered, the ones the curators kept for themselves, and no one else, someone quietly rewrote the heading above humanity's file. It no longer read, cataloging in progress, it read, simply, undefeated.